This is Apple's brand new iPhone 15. There isn't anything inside that we haven't seen before in other phones. But that doesn't mean it's not a good phone. A phone can still be very good even if it's not new. These two things can happen at the same time. It seems that this is actually Apple's plan with this phone. The more I use this phone, the more I see Apple's strategy of being a late mover. They take something we've already seen before and do it in the Apple way. So, how would I describe this new phone's design? It looks familiar, kind of like the iPhone 14. Apple says the iPhone 15 has an all-new design that's simply gorgeous. All new? I don't know about that, but it definitely looks a lot like last year's model. However, what's at least a little new is how it feels in your hand. I mentioned this in the 15 Pro review, but Apple has done a good job of softening the corners on this phone. It still looks boxy and has aluminum sides, but it's more comfortable to hold because the corners are not as sharp. They are a bit more rounded. Also, this is the first non-Pro iPhone with a glass back that has a satin finish. I really like the satin back. It feels like soft, frosted glass. I know there's a very complicated process to make the back of this phone with one piece of glass that has two different colors and thicknesses. I can respect that effort, but honestly, the colors this year are really weak. In the last video, people said the color grading must be wrong because the phone looked white instead of blue. But no, this blue phone really doesn't look very blue in most lighting. It's like 1% blue. But on the bright side, with the aluminum and light colors, these are probably the most fingerprint-resistant iPhones in years. The buttons, speakers, and mute switch are all in the same place. And there's no action button on this phone. Honestly, you could probably use an iPhone 14 case on the iPhone 15. On the front, there's a new screen. Well, not exactly new, but new to this iPhone. This year, the non-Pro iPhones now have the Dynamic Island, which is Apple's way of doing the hole punch cutout. So, the notch is finally gone, at least until a new iPhone SE might bring it back. But over the past year, app developers have been slowly adapting to the Dynamic Island in useful ways. I already have a few favorite apps now, like my airline apps that give me real-time flight info, weather apps, and Uber. While we're talking about the screen, it's also brighter now. It can go up to 2000 nits, which looks great when you're outside, but it's 2023, and this $800 phone still has a 60 Hz display. That's really interesting to me. It's kind of strange. On one hand, for most people buying this phone, it's totally fine. It's a new basic iPhone. If you've talked to someone who buys a basic iPhone, they literally don't care about the display refresh rate. It doesn't matter to them. It's not something they notice. If you ask them right now how many frames per second their phone has, they wouldn't know. As long as the phone works and is as smooth as last year's or the years before, it's not a big deal. I've even given people a 120 Hz phone right next to a 60 Hz phone, and even when they're side by side, they can't see the difference. Or if they do notice, it's just like, oh, that's a subtle thing that seems kind of nice, but they'd be totally fine without it. So, for the people this phone is aimed at, it's completely fine. But on the other hand, Apple, the richest technology company in the world, often makes subtle improvements or changes that regular people will never notice, all the time. Like when Apple switched these baseline iPhones from LCD to OLED displays, do you think most people notice that? Or what about upgrading from the A15 Bionic chip last year to the A16 Bionic this year? Do you think people actually see the difference? Or when they added 5G to the iPhone, most people didn't really care. Making subtle improvements over time is what modern smartphones are all about these days. And I would argue that a higher refresh rate is actually more noticeable to more people than some of those other changes. I think if you handed me two iPhones, one with an A15 Bionic and one with an A16 Bionic, and they were unlabeled, it would take me a while to notice the real differences between them. Given that it's now cheap and easy to get a phone with at least a 90 Hz display, like the new Moto G, which has a 90 Hz screen and costs around $170, it's surprising that Apple doesn't include a higher refresh rate in the iPhone 15. I'm sure that Moto G screen looks terrible compared to this iPhone. It's 720p and has very low brightness. But Motorola added a 90 Hz display to that phone because they knew people would notice and appreciate the smoother performance. It's surprising to me that Apple doesn't include a higher refresh rate on the iPhone 15, especially since it would be easy for them to do. They choose not to because they reserve that feature for their Pro models. It's a way to promote the Pro phones. It seems to me like Apple uses this strategy to keep widening the gap between the Pro and non-Pro iPhones. They're happy to do this, even if it means the iPhone 15 ends up being one of the most expensive phones with just a 60 Hz display. Speaking of widening the gap, the Pro models this year got a new A17 Pro chip, while the iPhone 15 uses last year's A16 Bionic from the 14 Pro. The fact that the Pro chip has a new name might be the most interesting part because it suggests it won't be used in the baseline phones next year. But still, the A16 Bionic in this iPhone 15 is more than enough for its price. It handles everyday tasks, gaming, and navigating iOS at 60 Hz very well. One advantage of a 60 Hz display is better battery life. Despite some issues, the battery life on these phones has been pretty good. Apple has now officially addressed the heat and battery issues that some people, including myself, reported with these iPhones. An iOS update is coming, and it seems that specific third-party apps like Instagram that were also causing problems will be getting updates too. On average, the battery life on my iPhone 15 has been better than on the 15 Pro, and the 15 Plus seems to have the best battery life ever for an iPhone, which is very promising. The combination of the A16 Bionic chip, which is not new, and the 60 Hz screen, which is also not new, is contributing to this great battery life. USB-C is not new either, but it's here now. It brings benefits like using the same cable to charge everything and connecting to more accessories, such as monitors and keyboards. It's a bit disappointing that the older chip means there's no USB 3 controller, so you won't get USB 3 data speeds. It's still slow. But honestly, unless you're using the Pro iPhone's camera features, most people buying this phone probably won't need fast data transfer anyway. So I guess it's something you can overlook. And Apple has managed to handle it in their own way. Apple even color-matched the inside of the USB-C port to the phone's color and printed the model number inside the port, hiding it in a very discreet way. I should also mention some of the clever new software features on the iPhone 15. For example, it has an ultra-wideband chip, which helps you find your phone more easily with an Apple Watch or be located on Find My Friends. That's new. They also added clever audio and video effects at the OS level, so they work in any app. You can be on a phone call, video call, or using apps like Google Meet or Zoom, and turn on background noise cancellation. It works surprisingly well and is very effective. So, if I'm on a phone call with myself, here's what it sounds like with a dishwasher, HVAC, and sink running next to the microphone. When I switch from standard mode to voice isolation mode, even though all the same noises are still happening, it does a much better job of focusing on just my voice. It's really smart and genuinely new. There are also some other updates that aren't as new, like downloadable offline areas in Apple Maps, interactive widgets, and an 80% battery charge limiter in the settings. You can explore all these features. I made a full video on the iOS 17 update, which you can watch at the link below the like button. Be sure to check it out after you finish this video. One of the most liked features I discussed in that video is standby mode. On the Pro iPhone, when you place it on a charger and turn it sideways, the screen stays on. This works because it switches to a 1 Hz refresh rate with its LTPO display, which is fine for keeping the screen on. On the non-Pro iPhone, which doesn't have an LTPO display, the screen is stuck at either 30 or 60 Hz and doesn't drop to 1 Hz. So Apple decides to turn off the screen after a short time, which feels like it undermines the purpose of the feature. You then have to nudge the table or bump the stand to wake it up, similar to how you would with an Apple Watch charger. It's a notable difference between the Pro and non-Pro iPhones. But lastly, the new cameras are actually interesting in a good way. The iPhone 15 now has an upgraded 12-megapixel ultra-wide camera and a new 48-megapixel main camera. The sensor isn't the same as the Pro models. It's slightly smaller. However, it has a larger maximum aperture of f1.6 to compensate. The camera combines pixel binning and detail transfer to produce a new 24-megapixel photo by default. If you remember, this iPhone uses the exact same A16 Bionic chip as last year's Pro model. It has the same processing cores, image signal processor, and neural engine. So why is this new 24-megapixel default only available on the new iPhone 15 and not on last year's Pro model? Even with the latest software update, last year's Pro phone still shoots at 12 megapixels. As a result, the photos on my base iPhone 15, which aren't zoomed in, are actually looking a bit better and more detailed compared to last year's Pro phones. There's also a new auto portrait mode detection feature, which is pretty cool. You don't have to switch to portrait mode to capture depth information for later use. As long as you're pointing the camera at a person, cat, or dog, as recognized by the neural engine, or if you tap to focus, you'll see a little F icon in the bottom corner of the screen. This means the camera is capturing the data needed for portrait mode. Exactly. If you decide later that you want the photo to be in portrait mode, you can go into your gallery and convert it to a portrait mode shot. You can even edit and adjust it after that. Some people describe this feature as allowing you to change the focus point of the photo later. You can't recover something that was out of focus originally, but for classic iPhone shots where everything looks in focus, you can use portrait mode to create a depth effect and get really good results. Last year's Pro iPhone also has the same chip, a 48-megapixel main camera, and the same neural engine. Yet it doesn't have this feature for some reason. It's kind of strange. In these reviews, we often make judgments about what typical iPhone buyers care about, what they notice, and what they will appreciate in a new phone. With this phone, Apple has added enough subtle improvements that, even though it looks similar and doesn't have many new features, it still feels like a noticeably better phone. My verdict is that if you have an iPhone 14, you don't need to upgrade right away, maybe not even if you have a 13. If you have an older phone and are considering upgrading, I wouldn't suggest getting last year's model to save money. I'd recommend going for the iPhone 15. There are enough new changes and improvements that make it worth the upgrade. The iPhone 15 is a better phone in every way, and it also has USB-C. When you buy a base iPhone, you're not looking for cutting-edge tech. You want something that works well, is familiar, and will last for a few years. Since we've moved to USB-C, I wouldn't recommend buying a Lightning iPhone. Just go for the new one. Just grab the new iPhone. Even if it seems a bit boring and doesn't have many groundbreaking features, it's going to work well and serve you reliably. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.